Hello, my name is Deadric Williams, and today I'll be discussing my recent paper with Regina Baker entitled Family Structure, Risk, and Racial Stratification in Poverty. This paper is really trying to get scholars to understand what do we mean by race, right? And so to begin, what we argue is that family structure, particularly marriage, is often seen as a leading mechanism or a leading theoretical idea that can reduce racial inequality and poverty. Now, prior research have shown time and time again that family structure does not fully account for the racial poverty gap. So in this paper, we critique previous research by making the argument that prior studies have done three things that limit our imagination when it comes to racial stratification and poverty. So first, race is often treated as some ahistorical demographic characteristic of the population. Second, family structure is often conceptualized as social capital. And third, prior research often use white families as a standard against which families of color are often measured. So we take an alternative and test whether or not family structure really accounts for the racial gap in poverty. What we do is pull on prior research and define risk as any variable that leads to a higher probability of being poor. And we conceptualize risk in terms of prevalences, that is how many risks families have, and then the penalties, that is what are the probabilities of being poor given a set of risk factors. And what we argue in the paper is that racial stratification tends to undergird racial inequality or racial stratification in poverty. So we use secondary data from the Fragile Families and Child Well-Being Study. We really rely on the mother's reports of poverty and their risk factors. So we end up measuring risk across a number of factors like poor health, unemployment, material hardship, paternal incarceration, low social support. But when we look at the penalties for risk, we see these dramatic findings. And what we show is basically that when we look at racial groups across racialized groups, we don't compare in the sense of analytic technique comparing. We run our analytic models for each racial group separately. And what we find is that when you're racialized as Black or racialized as Latinx in the US, the probability of being poor when you're married and have zero risk is about the same. Is about the same probability of being poor relative to white mothers who are married and have three or more risks. So in many ways, our findings are showing that it's more about the stratification, the racial stratification in the US than the actual family structure. That is, when we look at married Black women, when we look at married Latinx women and married white women, what we find is that the returns to marriage are not the same across racialized groups. That is, you can be married and have zero risk, but still have a higher risk for poverty when you're racialized as Black and Latinx compared to white mothers. And even more, that when you're Black and Latinx mother who are unmarried with three or more risk, the probability of being poor is much higher than white mothers who are unmarried with three or more risk. And so what we argue or what we conclude in our study is that basically family structure in many ways is an oversimplified explanation for racial stratification and poverty. What we urge scholars to do is conceptualize race as a social construction, theorize racism and not race, and employ analytic techniques within racial groups so that we can understand that variation. And the variation within racial groups can potentially give us a path forward of thinking about how racism undergirds racial stratification and poverty. Thank you.